All right, so we're going to be dealing with some both difficult material in terms of it'll be a little challenging to get our head around it, and we're also going to be dealing with some difficult material in the second half of the class that maybe, and this is for the benefit of those who might be watching at home, may be topics that they would rather approach with their children with a more delicate and measured process. And so I strongly encourage if there's anybody with children who is watching the video to watch it first, decide whether it fits with where their children are and what their children already know, because there will be certain topics and concepts that they probably would want to handle in their own way. So with that public service announcement out of the way at the beginning, let's get down to the logic side, because we're going to be dealing a lot in today's discussion with distinctions and similarities. How many people here when you were going to school had teachers give you assignments where they would say, compare and contrast the British parliamentary system with the American Congress? Yes, or compare and contrast the War of 1812 with the Revolutionary War. Compare and contrast was a standard staple for teachers when I was growing up as a way of giving you an essay assignment. And we were all used to it. If we have the word cat and we have the word dog, what's going to be different between the two of them and what's going to overlap? Give me some examples.
4 feet.
What's that?
4 feet.
4 feet. That's a really big cat.
And
A
they're
4-foot cat is really
Whiskers.
Mammals.
What's that? Mammals.
Tails.
Nope.
They both have tails.
Should have made the middle part bigger. No one's going to give me any of the contrast?
Whiskers.
Do dogs have whiskers?
Some, but not all.
What's that? Cats definitely do. See, this is the thing I found. If you make a mistake in a video, you get a lot more people writing comments about it than if you get everything right. So if we're not sure about the whiskers, we're hoping that all the people watching the video will chime in and tell us, yeah, because you say dogs didn't have whiskers. And then we'll get some reaction. What's that?
One barks and the other meows.
Barks. Meows. I guess.
Cats clean themselves, lick themselves.
Oh, now we're going to get into personal. Clean. Is that? Are you saying dogs are dirty then? I'll get Arlene in here on you. They clean themselves. Yes. Whereas dogs are a bit less self-grooming. Fastidious is a good way of putting it. We might also have, something like the litter box and outside. We hope.
Clumsy and graceful. Cats are graceful.
I was going to say, which is which? I'm not going to write that up. I'll get hate mail for writing that up. I'll leave that as an unsupported response from the class. Okay, maybe cats and dogs are too controversial, but one of the topics that we're going to be seeing today, what we're going to start off with, is talking about different types of food, different categories of food. And it's not the kosher, non-kosher that you might be thinking. This goes back to our roots, pardon the pun, in the agricultural world of the ancient world. So we're going to be dealing with Parashat Ki Tavo, and Ki Tavo begins with an ordinance that has to do with Ki Tavo, when we come in to the land of Israel, something that's going to happen that wasn't happening while we were still living in the wilderness. And agriculture is a big part of that. For as long as we lived in the wilderness, although it wasn't the aimless wandering that you often hear it caricatured as, nevertheless, we were not farmers out in the wilderness. And we are going to suddenly become farmers now that we're settling into the land of Israel. And farming is not just an economic enterprise. Farming is a religious activity in Judaism. And so we're going to see some of the institutions that go along with the religious nature of this endeavor. All right, good. So we're starting right at the beginning of Ki Tavo on page 1140, or in chapter 26, verse 1, if you are using a different copy of the Torah. Chapter 26, Deuteronomy, verse 1, looking for a volunteer. Somebody who's always wanted to talk about farming. Thank you, Mary.
When you enter the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a heritage, and you possess it and settle in it, you shall take some of every first fruit of the soil, which you harvest from the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Put it in a basket and go to the place where the Lord your God will choose to establish his name. You shall go to the priest in charge at the time and say to him.
Pause. So what we're dealing with here is what's called bikurim. And those of you who are participating in our Mishnah class know that this is what we've been studying for a few weeks. And bikurim is the ceremony of bringing the first fruits to the temple. And we've got a lot of questions that are going to come up here of, okay, who has to bring it? How do you know what's the first fruit? Do we bring all types of fruit? Is it only things I grew? And there are many different elements that we're going to need to explain. But let's make sure we get the rest of the ceremony out of the way first.
I acknowledge this day before the Lord your God that I have entered the land that the Lord swore to our fathers to assign us. The priest shall take the basket from your hand and set it down in front of the altar of the Lord your God. You shall then recite as follows before the Lord your God. My father was a fugitive Aramean. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there. But there he became a great and very populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. We cried to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our plea and saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. The Lord freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm and awesome power, and by signs and portents. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Wherefore I now bring the first fruits of the soil which you, O Lord, have given me.
Does this text sound familiar at all to anyone?
That's part of the liturgy.
Part of the liturgy for a particular holiday.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the Hebrew too.
Yes, exactly. A very, very famous holiday that also talks about Egypt. Pesach. In the traditional Haggadah, the phrase that you just read, this paragraph, this declaration of the giving of the first fruits, forms the nucleus around which the entire Maggid section, around which the entire telling of the Exodus is traditionally told. We use these sentences, these phrasings, and these specific words to unpack and retell the whole narrative of the coming out of Egypt. We don't go back and reread all the first few chapters of Exodus. We read this tiny paragraph, and then we unzip it and take out each piece in turn to explain and understand and to discuss what it meant to live in Egypt and to leave Egypt. So this is the core of that traditional retelling that happens at Pesach. Because that takes a lot of work, many modern Haggadot have, shall we say, replaced it with more user-friendly texts with which to retell the story of the Exodus. But traditionally, this is the core of that telling. Okay, keep going. We're almost done with our text reading.
You shall leave it before the Lord your God and bow low before the Lord your God. And you shall enjoy, together with the Levite and the stranger in your midst, all the bounty that the Lord your God has bestowed upon you and your household.
Okay, very good, right? So, we now know how to do bikurim, how to do the first fruits, right? We got all the information we needed? No? What else would you like to know to be able to do this ceremony?
Well, I would like to know where the first fruits came from because it was derived.
Okay, so
So who owns it?
which/whose first fruits? It's kind of an important question. I mean, are we all responsible for bringing everyone's first fruits? Is it only fruit I planted as opposed to fruit that someone else planted before me? If I now have an olive tree that was planted by someone 100 years ago, do I bring it, or does his descendants bring it? Who owns which land? Who owns the fruit that's coming from that land? Is a rather important question, and one indeed that our tradition does go into some detail on. Any other questions that you might want to know before this? How about when? When do I bring the first fruits? I mean,
As soon as you have it.
as soon as you have it? So technically, it can.
They'll spoil next week.
So technically, they can be brought at any time that they are harvested, but officially the time when they are brought and when the formula is said in the way that was outlined here is between Shavuot and Sukkot. Between the beginning of the major harvest season and the end of the major harvest season, which goes from early summer all the way through till early autumn. Although it's early autumn this year, since Sukkot comes quite a bit earlier in the solar calendar. Right? Okay, now there are a couple other questions in here that you might not have thought yet because you're not a farmer, but how do I know which is first? How do I know which fruit is first? You know, for us, you go to the supermarket, there's just a stack of oranges. Do you know which orange came off the tree first?
But if you're growing the crops, you see which ones are developing first.
So that means that you're going to be engaged actively in the day-to-day maintenance, as you should be, of your food, and making sure that you can tell which is exactly which and which is coming first. And we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail. But we also have to know which fruit is being brought. So for example, if I have my lovely little house with my lovely little farm and lovely little orchard, and there's a wild strawberry bush, do I have to keep an eye on the wild bush to see what is its first fruits and bring it? Or do I not? Or is it only the fruit that I plant? And is it every type of fruit that I plant, or are there limits to which types of fruit I'm going to be bringing?
I was going to ask, are all fruits created equal?
Are all fruits created equal? Exactly. Endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. Well, we certainly know from taste that that's not true. And we're going to see that that's not true in practice either. I'm going to pass this around, and I'm going to stress more strenuously than usual. Do not turn it over. And remember, it's almost Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. You don't want to be in trouble with your teacher right before Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Well, some of you, might be wondering, the Rebbe was talking about a, warning that you should watch this whole thing before showing it to small children. What in the world are we going to talk about that has to do with fruit and farming that you would need to warn someone about? And that's what's on the back page, and that's why we're holding off for the moment.
Oh, that's the part with the birds and the bees, I know.
That's the part with the birds and the bees, exactly. They have bees help with the fruit. And we're finding out that without bees that we're going to be in real trouble, and as a matter of fact, yes. Okay, so who'd like to help us with a little bit of Mishnah, a little bit of clearing up some of the basic questions and making distinctions between one type and another? Yes?
How does one set aside bikurim?
Remember, bikurim is the Hebrew word for the first fruits.
A man goes down into his field, he sees a fig that's ripened, or a cluster of grapes that ripen, or a pomegranate that ripened. He ties a reed, a rope around it, and says, "Let these be bikurim."
All right, before we get to dissenting opinion, let's make sure we understand the scenario. You're a farmer. You go down the next morning to your field, your orchard, your vineyard, and you say, "Oh, look, the grapes are finally ripened. These will be my bikurim. These will be my first fruit." You take out a bit of string, tie it around that cluster, tie it around that pomegranate, or what have you, and now it's been designated. Now you'll know, come time to actually harvest it, which one was the bikurim, which one was designated for the bikurim. Because you know what? You might forget which cluster of grapes it was when you come back a week or 2 weeks later, if you don't make a mark to remind yourself. Pretty practical, yes? Very straightforward? We are nothing if not a practical people.
Let these be bikurim. Rabbi Shimon says, even so, he must again designate them as bikurim after they have been plucked from the soil.
All right, so Rabbi Shimon has a different opinion. He says just tying it to the fruit that's still growing is not sufficient. It's sufficient to designate physically which bit of fruit you're going to use, but you have to designate it again formally once it has been clipped and harvested. Why? Well, because just about everything else in Judaism is not designated until it's been harvested. When we have to give tithes, we have to harvest first before we can designate. When we give truma, which is a gift to the Kohanim, we harvest first and then we designate. And this is actually very atypical. The normal process is harvest, designate. And Rabbi Shimon is saying that it should follow that same procedure. But the other sages, the other Chachamim, are saying no. It should be designated on the tree, and before you harvest it, that is sufficient. And after you harvest it, you don't have to do anything extra. How are we doing on this? Seems like an esoteric distinction.
You still have to gather it and bring it to the synagogue, to the rabbi, to whoever.
You still have to gather it.
I don't understand why there's a need for a second designation. You actually pick it and bring it with that purpose.
So because in our thinking, there is a distinction between still growing and mine. That while something is still growing, as you might classically say, you can't count your chickens before they hatch. Once it's been harvested, now it is your property. Now you have the right to designate it. To designate something while it's still growing may seem a bit presumptuous, may seem a bit making a declaration before the time is ripe, if you'll excuse the pun. Whereas once it's been harvested, now it's firmly in your possession. Now you have the authority to make a designation. And Rabbi Shimon is saying, really, the authority to make that designation is only possible after it's been harvested. It would be the equivalent of, before you own a car, you can't buy insurance for it. You actually kind of have to own it, or else you don't have the authority to buy insurance for it. You can't hire a contractor to remodel a house until you've actually been given legal title to the house. I guess you could hire him, but he couldn't go in and start hacking things apart. Similarly, says Rabbi Shimon, until you've plucked it, until you've gathered it, it doesn't belong to you. Who does it still belong to? God, exactly. When in doubt, God. That's the safe answer. Still belongs to God. So therefore, if it still belongs to God while it's growing, I don't have the right to designate it. Whereas the other rabbis say no, because specifically we are trying to designate the fruit as it is growing, because that is the spiritual intent, to remind ourselves of God while it is growing. For this particular mitzvah of bikurim, yes, we can designate before it's been harvested. And that is different than all the other agricultural procedures. That's a better word. So it makes a distinction of spirit, even if in the end it doesn't make a practical distinction. But since the mitzvot are intended to guide us spiritually, not merely to regulate our lives practically, a difference in spirit is a big difference. And that's why the rabbis are arguing about it. Okay, keep going.
And not all the first fruits of every species, because not all fruits are subject to the mitzvah of first fruits, only the 7 species. Here in our verse it says word, Eretz, land, and there in the verse describes the praise of Eretz Yisrael. It says a land, Eretz, a wheat and barley, vines and figs and pomegranates, a land of oil-producing olives and honey. Just as the earlier verse is referring to the 7 species through which Eretz Yisrael is praised, year 2. Then the verse mentions...
Hold on.
Okay.
So, which fruits do we need to bring bikurim for?
7.
The 7 species, right? Which we have a list right there: the wheat, the barley, the vines, meaning wine from grapes, the figs and pomegranates, and the olive oil from olive and honey. What's that? Okay, so again, to go back to our cats and dogs diagram, there's a lot of overlap between the 7 species and other types of fruits and other types of produce. So for example, you're still going to make a blessing on them both, you're still going to tithe them, etc., etc. But you were going to do bikurim only on them, not on the others. And the way the rabbis try to prove that is by saying that because it says you come into the land, to Eretz, and the other place that that term is used in a similar fashion is when describing the bounty of the land, the Eretz, is limited to those 7 special categories of food. Those must be what is being referred to in this section of Torah as well. God just didn't copy it over because, you know what, he figured we were smart and could figure that out without having to copy it over. Right? You don't want the Torah to be longer than necessary. How are we doing? You see how they're making the distinction between now the 7 species and every other type of species? So for oranges, you don't have to bring bikurim, no first fruits. For pomegranates, you do. For apples, no. Watermelon, no. Wheat, yes. Oats, no. And by doing so, again, we're not just talking about making a practical distinction between these and the other. We're also talking about connecting the farmers, the people who were living off the land, which was the vast majority of people for most of history, to the specific blessings for which the land of Israel was praised by God. So it's not just, hey, I really like apples, so I'm going to bring apples. It's, pomegranates are really, really special because God chose to bless the land of Israel in this particular way. Sure, Israel can grow oranges like nobody's business, and they got all sorts of other good things there too. But these are the unique blessings for which Israel is known, and therefore those are the unique blessings for which I give thanks to God in this very unique way of bringing them to the temple. Again, it's about shaping the spiritual path that a person is going through. So it's not simply about giving, but it's about giving in response to a particular set of circumstances, a particular blessing that God has given us.
Don't they say pomegranates have 613 seeds?
That is indeed the Midrashic interpretation. They do not, but that is indeed the Midrashic interpretation. They do have an awful lot of seeds, but not quite or precisely 613. So yes, but one of the reasons why we focus on pomegranates is precisely because of this. One of the reasons why even in the middle of parts of Europe where no one had ever seen a pomegranate in their whole life, they still put pomegranates on their Torah, which is what we call rimonim. The finials, to use an English word that's also pretty useless, the finials on top of the Torah, the little silver shafts with the decorations at the top, are called rimonim. And a rimon is a pomegranate. And that's one of the reasons. The other reason, of course, is that pomegranates were attached to the garments of the high priest. And so in this way we are dressing the Torah in a way similar to the way the high priest was dressed.
And the cover of our cookbook.
Exactly. And the cover of the cookbook. So pomegranates have remained a very important symbol of God's blessing, even if someone grew up, lived a life, and died without having ever eaten one. They remained an important staple of our spiritual diet. And they're really tasty too, and apparently very healthy from what modern research has shown. Okay, just a pain to eat. All right, so now we've got another distinction to take care of though, because it's said in our verse that we should, take them, right? And we should go to the priest, and that we should go to the place. Well, which place? Right? So let's see what Rashi says.
When the verse mentions this place, it refers to the temple. The expression must refer specifically to the temple and not to the land of Israel in general, because the following clause refers to the land explicitly.
Right? Perfectly logical sense. When it says that God brought us to this place and this land, well, this place and this land must not be synonymous because the Torah is not redundant. So therefore, this land is explicit. We know what that is. It's the land of Israel. What must the place be? It must be the temple. Problem. When did the temple get built, or who built the temple? Solomon. Was Solomon a contemporary of Joshua when we entered the land? So for the 400 years in between Joshua leading us into the land and Solomon building the temple, New? Did we do this? Did we not bring the first fruits until Solomon built the temple?
We have the tabernacle.
Ah, we had the tabernacle, we had the Mishkan. But according to our sages, there's the Mishkan and then there's the Mishkan. That there is a way to, again, going back to our distinctions, to distinguish between the Mishkan at some times and the Mishkan at other times. And that the offerings were brought during some times and not others. And let's go ahead and keep reading and we'll see the distinction they make.
Okay, but what happened before the temple was built? The Mishkan
Sorry, that should be was. When the Mishkan was at Shiloh.
was at Shiloh, the offerings were brought, but when it was at Nob and Gibeon, they were not.
All right, so the Mishkan was portable. And that's the whole point of it, moving around with us during the wilderness travels. But even within the land of Israel, the Mishkan had more than one home during those centuries. Now, the most established and most long-lasting was when it was at Shiloh. And during that time, according to the Sifrei, which was the earliest collection of Midrashim about the book of Deuteronomy, then the offerings were brought. But when it was housed at the other locations, the offerings were not brought. Which, of course, forces us to ask the question, why not? What's so different between Shiloh and the other places? Why should it be brought or allowed to be brought in one case and not the other? First explanation.
The Mishkan was erected at Shiloh with the consensus of Joshua, the elders and the people. And the whole congregation of the children of Israel assembled themselves in Shiloh and set up the tent meeting there. And the land was subdued before him.
All right, so based on the 18th chapter of the book of Joshua, and specifically that phrase, the whole congregation came and they assembled the tabernacle there, Torah Tamimah says that means that Mishkan had the offerings because it was agreed upon by everyone. That it was a consensus. That because Joshua, the elders, and the people all agreed that this was where they wanted the tabernacle to be, that's why people were required to then bring the first fruits there. Because think of the alternative. What might be the issue when it comes to the placement of the Mishkan? What might be the problem here? Distance, exactly. I mean, so I'm in, the tribe of Naphtali, and you're in the tribe of Gad, and he's in the tribe of Benjamin, and he's in the tribe of, Dan. Is it going to be in my territory, your territory? Do I have to walk 20 feet and you have to walk 40, 50, 60 miles?
Grapes will turn to raisins.
Grapes will turn to raisins. And actually the Mishnah does talk about that. If you live too far, you bring the dried version rather than the fresh, rotten version. But yeah, you're already prescient about what the issues can be. But when it was at Shiloh, because it had been erected there with communal consent, therefore everybody was communally obligated. That by consent of the governed, so to speak, it became then an obligation upon everyone until it got moved. And once it had been moved and re-erected elsewhere because of necessary circumstances, unfortunately, and the fluctuations of Israel's fortune, it meant that in the new locations it was not being erected by universal acclaim or agreement, but being erected simply out of necessity, and because of that you couldn't then force everybody to have to come. Not until it was erected permanently in the form of the temple in Jerusalem, which became the indisputable and agreed upon capital for all time. So don't think we're going to put a new one up anywhere else. But that's not the only explanation.
The interior walls of the Mishkan were made of stone at Shiloh.
So Abravanel says no, or maybe he says no. We're going to see someone who tries to harmonize these two opinions, but he offers a different explanation. He says no, the difference was that at Shiloh, the interior walls of the Mishkan were made of stone rather than the portable wood that had been used during the traveling. And as such, it was a more permanent, more fixed structure, and therefore maybe it made more sense that you could obligate everyone to come to this fixed structure, because after all, it wasn't going to get up and move tomorrow. It would be there for some time. And that permanence was the reason why you could make an obligation, and therefore the permanence of the temple has a similar characteristic, and that would then mean you would bring to the temple instead. Which do we like? Construction method or committee decision? Construction. If you build it out of stone, then they will come. If it's still the house of sticks, well, we know what will happen to that little pig. It's not permanent enough, and therefore you can't expect people to show up with their baskets. Yeah, exactly. The big bad wolf. Yes? No? Maybe so?
I think the other.
You think the consensus is more compelling? Because?
Because if everyone agreed to it, then they're only obligated to abide by the rules.
If it's a consensus, then you agreed to it. You signed on the dotted line, therefore you should be obligated, even if it is inconvenient for you or your family. Of course, that doesn't explain why later generations might have also been obligated, but that may be another conversation for another time. But luckily we've got Malbim, and Malbim is a later commentator who tries to harmonize these two different opinions.
Both opinions are correct, and the walls were made of stone at Shiloh because it alone was established by consensus.
So he says, yes, the walls at Shiloh were made of stone, and that is what gave it a sense of permanence. But the only reason they made those walls of stone was because it had been agreed upon by everyone to do so. So it was its permanence based upon consensus that gave it its special status of all of the locations of the Mishkan during those hundreds of years in between arrival and the establishment of Jerusalem. Make sense? Okay, don't turn over yet. Distinctions are really, really important in the discussion of Bikurim. And in fact, our Mishnah students will tell you that in the chapters of discussion, there are many digressions where they go into differences between certain types of animals and differences between certain types of offerings, because they recognize that there are things that fall under one category and things that fall under another category, and things that share similar rulings and things that don't share any rulings at all. As such, the last chapter of the Mishnah on Bikurim is traditionally given over to a rather unique set of distinctions and their implications for Jewish law. So, who'd like to read on the back? You can turn over now. Edie?
The hermaphrodite is in some ways like men, and in other ways like women. In other ways, he is like men and women, and in others, he is like neither men nor women.
Okay, we got that? So let's make sure we understand what the sages are saying, is that generally speaking, we've got women and we've got men, but when you've got somebody that has the sexual characteristics of both, and we're talking, sets of equipment here, not just proclivities, but physically shares the sexual characteristics of both, what do you do? and as we've seen, the rabbis, they like being able to tell, this is this and this is that. This is in this circle, this is in that circle, this overlaps here, this overlaps here. They're not going to let an entire category of people go unaccounted for. No matter how rare it may be, that still needs to be sorted out. And the solution is that there are cases where they share exactly the same rulings as men and women also both equally share. There are cases where they share rulings that are based upon women, and cases where they share rulings based upon men, and cases where they are a category unto themselves. It's just that easy. Right? And as we're going to see, this is not the only way to deal with people who have differing sexuality. Those of you who've been following the news lately may have heard some ruckus from the former Soviet Union, from Russia. Anyone been keeping track on that? Not what they're doing with the Middle East, but internal to Russia.
They're disallowing gays.
Well, they would officially deny, and we're going to look at the distinction they're trying to ride here, that they are disallowing homosexuality. They are claiming that their new law prohibits gay propaganda. But as we're going to see, that may be a distinction without a difference. As a matter of fact, as much as we like making distinctions, sometimes there isn't one. Yes?
A process question. Do you think that the rabbis put this section in there because they were seriously concerned about the rights and privileges of Maccabees, or was it an exercise in law?
Yes.
Brain training.
I think it was included in this particular section of the Mishnah because the brain was already thinking about categories and distinctions and differences and similarities. So in terms of where they edited it, I think yes. But I think they were also concerned that hermaphrodites could either be exploited or abused, or could get away with things that they shouldn't. That there had to be some understanding of how they fit into society and how they fit into the tableau of Torah. And that would not just be simply by pigeonholing them into this category or that category. It would take a more nuanced and complicated approach.
It's such a rare condition. Are we to conclude from that there must have been a larger population at that time?
I actually have never come across research which suggests one way or the other whether it was more or less common in the ancient world.
If the rabbis were talking about gays, then I can understand because a lot more of those than there are.
Yes, and homosexuality, the rabbis did not talk about homosexuality as an orientation. They talked about it as a specific act. Whereas in this particular case, when talking about a hermaphrodite, they're talking about a full-on 24/7 physical condition. It's not something that a person would do, it's something that a person was. And as such, they needed to find a way to understand it, and a way to put it into the overall framework of Torah. But let's make sure we understand what the Russian law is, so hopefully we can compare and contrast the Russian handling of the situation with the Jewish handling of the situation. And again, there is a difference between being a hermaphrodite and someone who is homosexual. It's only because of the proximity to what we have been studying and what we're doing in the Torah portion that we're focusing on this as a tool for helping to begin the discussion, not to end it. Edie, I think you were reading? So this is from the Russian law code.
Propaganda is the act of distributing information among minors that, one, is aimed at creating non-traditional sexual attitudes, two, makes non-traditional sexual relations attractive, three, equates the social value of traditional and non-traditional sexual relations, or four, creates an interest in non-traditional sexual relations.
All right. So an extremely vague and an extremely vulnerable law that's ripe for vicious interpretation. Because if you were going to construct this as broadly as possible, what sort of things might be prohibited? Well, for example, if two people who were homosexual were walking down the street, are they allowed to hold hands?
Apparently not.
Apparently not, because there might be youth around, and you are presenting what appears to be an equality between that relationship and the traditional relationship between men and women.
But I think it would be more noticeable in males and females. Females do tend to hold hands.
Depending upon the culture, it may be more or less common for men and women to hold hands in public with the same gender, but this would at least provide them with an opportunity to investigate. Would someone be allowed to wear a gay pride button? No. Would someone be allowed to make a public speech on the rights of gays and lesbians? No. Would someone be allowed to broadcast information about decisions in the West, in Europe or America, regarding the rights of gays or lesbians? No. So essentially, every public act that could be interpreted as being possibly motivated by homosexuality or the equality of homosexuality is prohibited by this law. And this is one of the reasons why the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, is asking for some assurances from Russia before the 2014 Winter Olympics take place. Because there will be, from numerous countries, gay and lesbian athletes. who are going to Russia. And if they mention that they are gay while they are there, will they be prosecuted? Will they be deported? What will happen? The incidence of violence against gays has skyrocketed in Russia over the last 10 years, and there is concern for the physical safety of athletes in the country. Question marks. Okay, let's turn back to the androgynous, as it's said in the Hebrew.
In what ways is he like both men and women? One who strikes him or curses him is liable. One who unwittingly kills him must go into exile, and if on purpose, then the slayer receives the death penalty. His mother must at his birth bring an offering. He may eat holy things that are eaten outside of the temple, and he may inherit any inheritance.
All right. So what possible reason might I think that if I were to punch or kill somebody that was a hermaphrodite, that I wouldn't be punished? That the rabbis feel they have to explain that yes, you would. I know our modern sensibilities may not entertain the notion, but to be perfectly honest, it's still in the eyes of many people. Somebody that is created in this way is suffering from a mutation that makes them subhuman, that makes them inhuman. And you wouldn't prosecute me for killing my cow, right? I know there are some people that would, but in general, societies don't. And the rabbis are trying to point out that yes, the person may fall out of the classical gender distinctions, that is the 99.999 whatever percent of humanity, but that doesn't mean they are not human. Yes, it does mean that they are going to be subject to some different laws because of the complicated nature of their sexual organs, but the basic humanity is something they share with everyone else in society. And that means protection from injury, it means protection from being cursed, it means protection from being murdered, it means protection for what they can bring as an offering, it means that or what they can eat from the temple, it means protection of what their mother would do when giving birth to such a child. She wouldn't treat it as though it was not a child, not a human being, and she would still bring the same offering she would bring for any child. And it means that they do not get disinherited just because they were born differently.
The inheritance thing, though, it seems to me the focus here is on the maleness of the hermaphrodite rather than the femaleness of the...
You mean with regards to the inheritance?
As far as inheritance goes, of course, they use the his, so because
well, that's...
do that. Right.
We're not going to call him an it, so...
Yeah, but generally inheritance is through males, and this is, as though we are identifying this male-female person and mostly male.
Well, there are circumstances where daughters and women do inherit. So, for example, if somebody passed away and had only daughters plus a hermaphrodite, the hermaphrodite would still inherit. And similarly, if they passed away leaving only sons and the hermaphrodite would still inherit. So it's saying that in this case, he does inherit no matter what the set of circumstances are, and should not be discounted. So since there are circumstances where women inherit and men inherit, the hermaphrodite does inherit. Make sense? Yes? Okay. Keep going.
And in what is he different from both men and women?
I.e., in what set of circumstances does the hermaphrodite fall completely outside of the rules governing men or women, or that cover men and women? In which case is he neither nor?
One does not burn truma if it came into contact with his discharge. Neither is he liable for entering the temple while impure. He must not be sold as a Hebrew slave. He cannot be evaluated. If one says, I will be a Nazarite, if he is neither a man nor a woman, then he becomes a Nazarite.
All right, so we'll get to the final opinion here in just a second because it introduces a new category. One does not burn truma if it came into contact with his discharge. Complicated story, hopefully short. If somebody is ritually impure, either a man from a unusual discharge or a woman from her discharge, and she or he comes into contact with truma, which is ritually pure food that has been donated to be eaten by the Kohanim, then the truma itself is burned, because it's now become ritually impure and cannot be cannot be purified, and therefore the only way to get rid of it is to burn it. If it comes into contact with the hermaphrodite, you don't burn it, because we're not sure if he's a man and therefore his discharge is from the man, or whether he's a woman and therefore the discharge is from the woman. And in different circumstances, it would or would not be impure. And since he falls outside those two categories, the same response does not kick in.
It seems illogical.
Yeah, to me too.
Seems illogical.
Seems unsanitary.
Seems unsanitary. Well, I should point out the truma is not eaten, but it is not burnt. Doesn't have to be burned either.
The point I was going to raise is that if it's either or, male or female, discharge causes truma to be tame.
But if a man has a discharge that, if it were done by a woman, would render something ritually impure, it does not render things ritually impure. And similarly, if a woman had a discharge of the color and style that a man might do, that would render something ritually impure, if she has that discharge of the same style and color, it does not render something ritually impure. And since
You don't know where it's coming from, basically.
exactly, and since he might be a man or he might be a woman in many different circumstances, we say that his discharge may or may not be something that renders something ritually impure. And since it's only maybe, we're not going to burn the truma.
It's hard to conceive of the discussion amongst the sages when they made these rulings.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was so early, there was no scientific
True.
analysis
Correct.
of all these
No
things.
DNA
They
analysis.
had to all
No.
be figured out in your head, and sometimes people are so set in their ways that they don't want to agree on something. It's just, not only this particular point,
No.
so many
Correct.
points of discussion. It's just hard to think of people sitting around and discussing these points and then finally coming to an agreement. That's the miraculous point.
It is miraculous that we could agree. Yes. And it is also, given that Judaism likes categories and likes distinctions. The whole Havdalah service is built around the idea of distinctions. The fact that the rabbis didn't simply say, you know what, if you're this different, we're just going to kind of write you out of the system. And there's the door, we can't deal with you. Just go away, we don't want to hear about it. The rabbis didn't do that. The rabbis said, okay, this is, as Michael pointed out, a real stretch for logic of trying to get our heads around all the permutations that this set of anatomy can present to us. But if we sit and we argue and we discuss and we think, we can work out the sets of parameters for what this person's life can be like within our community. The person was not pushed out of the community. Yes, there were restrictions put onto them because of the unique physiology, but the person was not kicked out. They were not sent away. They were not called evil. They were not a crime against nature or all the other things that hermaphrodites have been called by other cultures in different times in history. They were a puzzle that needed to be solved because they didn't fall neatly into the categories that were most common within society.
It would be interesting to know how other cultures or religions dealt with this situation.
Generally not well. There were a few cases where it was considered a spiritual boon to represent both genders as a form of blending different aspects of multiple gods or deities. But generally speaking, most cultures did not respond favorably to people who were born with these attributes.
They just didn't want to bow.
Well, that's a diplomatic way of putting it. Oftentimes people were disgusted, were offended, were insulted, felt threatened, felt that this was undermining their culture, their values. Because one of the reasons why societies make distinctions is because it allows us to distinguish between what is approved and what is disapproved. When we make a distinction between what you can take and what you take it, and we call it stealing, we are trying to guide society in a certain way. When we make a distinction between when you can use violence and when you can't, we're trying to guide society in a certain way. And when you get a category like this, how you make the distinctions that will either include them in some parts of society and exclude from others, or would push them entirely out of society, is making a very strong statement about what you want your society to look like. And the rabbis were not going to say, oh, sure, no problem, just do what you like, because Torah doesn't tell any of us to just do what we like. Torah demands limits from all of us. But they did try to set out what was their best interpretation of what was fair to a person who was born with this set of anatomy.
It would seem that with the compassion of God, any creature that he created, that there would be some place in society for that creature.
In the eyes of God, there is a place for all of God's creatures. In the eyes of the neighbors, it doesn't always work out so easily. And the rabbis, I think, were very aware of that. And in fact, in the interest of time, we're going to look at the last paragraph and see what the rabbis felt in general about things that were beyond allowing to continue.
Rabbi Yossi says the hermaphrodite is a unique creature, and the sages could not decide about him. But this is not so with the tumtum, one of doubtful sex. For sometimes he is a man, and sometimes he is a woman.
So the category of tumtum apparently is someone that is born with their sexual organs hidden, covered by a fold of skin, or in other ways somehow had not actually exited the body at the time of birth. And what Rabbi Yossi is saying here, and that actually wasn't the piece I was just referring to, but what Rabbi Yossi is saying here is that a tumtum is handled a bit differently because they are one or the other. We just can't see because it's hidden beneath the skin. And as such, it's just a matter of finding out which it is, which he or she is. And then you can put them into the proper category and we're done. It's really only the hermaphrodite that forces this great exercise of trying to logically deduce how you handle a person that doesn't fit neatly into the categories that you already thought pre-existed. All right, final paragraph.
The following can be saved from sinning, even at the cost of their lives.
All right, so let's make sure we understand the terminology here. I'm going to save you by killing you. All right, I'm saving you, well, I'm saving your soul. Because if I allow you to keep doing what you look like you're about to do, you will sin. Now, obviously, the rabbis are concerned that people might think, well, hey, if I see anybody about to sin, whether it be having a ham sandwich, whether it be, treating someone disrespectfully, whether it be forgetting to give tzedakah, then I should be able to kill them. Because after all, they're going to sin, I should kill them before they can have that tarnish on their soul. And the rabbis want to make sure that's not the way we live. And so they limit rather severely what a person can be stopped from doing at the expense of their own life.
He who pursues after his neighbor to slay him, or after a male to rape him, or after a betrothed maiden to rape her.
Meaning all three of those categories, if you see someone chasing another person to kill them, or chasing another person to rape them, male or female, you can stop the attacker, even if it means having to kill them before they have committed the crime. I mean, make sure we understand that. I haven't killed the guy yet. I'm just about to do it. And yet you are allowed to kill me to stop me from killing him. Use of lethal force would be the modern terminology. Okay, got a little phone ring in the background. That's okay. On the other hand, Edie, you want to keep going?
But he who pursues after an animal to have relations with it, or one who could violate the Sabbath or commit idolatry, must not be saved from sinning at the cost of his life.
So even if someone is, pursue is perhaps a strong word, even if someone is clearly about to engage in the act of bestiality, even if someone is clearly about to engage in an act that would violate Shabbat, even if someone is clearly about to engage in an act of idolatry, you do not get to make the judgment call that it's better that they be dead now than commit that sin. Yes? No? Reactions? Comments? So it is important, and I will say that Russia has certainly the right to try and decide what it thinks is best for its society, but I do believe that Judaism requires of us to say what we think about the decisions of others in regards to their society. So we can't violate the sovereignty of Russia, but I think that our tradition has said, look, there are things that we approve of and things we disapprove of, and we often disagree on some of those. And certainly the category of homosexuality itself has been a topic of conversation for much of the last 30 or 40 years. But no one says that barring a violent attempt to actually perpetrate your sexual preference on another person, that such people should be punished or harmed. They can be argued against. You can try and convince someone not to do something, but you don't get to kill them, and you don't get to punish them for simply being who they are. You can disagree. You can try to persuade. That's certainly within limited bounds, a possibility, but you don't get to punish for disagreement over just who the person is. And in my opinion, I think Russia has gone a little too far here. I'm sure that Russia is very worried about seeming strong against Western influences, and I'm sure that they are extremely terrified about their plummeting birth rate. And this is a very nice red herring for both of those issues for them. But it's not going to solve their problems, and it is dehumanizing a portion of their population in a way that the rest of the world should indeed say that is not right. And with that, we will finish for the day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.